We're a little low on people. I'm Rabbi O'Connor. I'm filling in today for Rabbi Spivak. My understanding is we are at Chav Zayin Amud Beis 27b in Rosh Hashanah, right after the Mishnah there. So about 10 lines down into the page, just about there. Okay, that's my understanding. Yeah, that's where we are, right there. Yeah, meaning until there was the Mishnah, now we're starting with the Gemara. Okay, and so now what we're discussing right now are the halachos of the shofar itself, what the shofar is supposed to look like, how it's supposed to, what the length, the size, right? So the Mishnah discussed some aspects of that, of a broken shofar. We've got where the shofar is supposed to be blown, if it's blown into a pit. So we're going to discuss these more in depth now. These were mentioned in the Mishnah, now we're discussing them in the Gemara. This is my first time giving the Daf Yomi class here, so I'm not sure what the pace is, so maybe you'll just correct me if I'm going too fast or too slow. So, okay. Tana Rabbanan. So the Gemara begins with stating a statement from the rabbis. Arach uktsaro. If it was long and you shortened the shofar, kosher, then it remains kosher. Gerdo v'hamido al gildo, kosher. If you ground it down and you brought it and you had it at the point of its so the way a shofar is, it has multiple layers of horn. So if you ground it down and you remove some of those layers, kosher remains kosher. Tzipehu zahav, if you gilded it in gold, b'makam anachas peh, where the mouth is supposed to go, puzzle, it also is puzzle. It's at that point it's no longer kosher. Shlo b'makam hanachas peh, if it's not where the mouth is, if it's not by the mouthpiece, kosher, then it remains kosher. Tzipehu zahav mibafnim, puzzle. If you gilded it in gold on the inside, it's invalid. Mibachutz, and if you gilded it with gold on the outside, again, obviously not where the mouthpiece is, im nishtana kolo mikimot shahaya, if the sound of it changes from what it used to be, puzzle, then it is invalid. Vim lav kosher, otherwise it remains kosher. Nikev, if there was a hole in the shofar, ustamo, and you filled it in, if it disturbs the sound of the shofar, puzzle, then it is invalid. Vim lav kosher, and otherwise it remains kosher. We are at 27b, a few lines down from the beginning of the Gemara. Nasan shofar b'soch shofar. If you place one shofar inside of another shofar, im kol panimi shama. If you're listening, if the sound that you're hearing is coming from the inside shofar, yatsa, then you fulfill your mitzvah. Vim kol chitzon shama. But if you're listening to the sound of the outer shofar, shama, if that's what you're hearing, I'm sorry, lo yatsa, then you are not fulfilling your mitzvah. Again, so we're on 27b, right before the lines get wide. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. So the rabbis learned. Gerdo bein mibafnim bein mibachutz kosher. If you ground it either on the inside or the outside, it remains kosher. Gerdo v'hamidu al gildo kosher. If you ground it, as we mentioned before, you remove some of the layers of the shofar, kosher, then it remains kosher. Hiniach shofar b'soch shofar. If you place one shofar, again, now we're on the first wide line. If you placed one shofar inside of another shofar, im kol panimi shama yatsa, im kol chitzon shama lo yatsa. As we mentioned before, if you are listening to the sound of the inner shofar, then you are fulfilling the mitzvah. If you listen to the sound of the outer shofar, since that outer shofar has something inside of it blocking it, then you are not fulfilling your mitzvah. Hafcho, if you flipped it, if you turned it inside out, the shofar, you turn the shofar inside out, v'takabo. So it's going to discuss two possibilities of what that means. So if you turned your shofar inside out, v'takabo, and you blew the shofar like that, lo yatsu, you do not fulfill your mitzvah. Amar of Papa, so Rav Papa is a later generation of rabbi, he qualifies this statement. Lo tema dahafche kikituna. We're not talking about where you flipped it inside out like a shirt. So like you take off a shirt backwards, right? In order to do that, you'd have to boil the shofar for a long time to the point where it gets really soft and actually twist it inside out. That's not what we're talking about. what you did was, while it was in its soft state, you widened what we would think of as the mouthpiece and turned that into the outside part of this emanating part of the shofar, and you shortened the wider part of the shofar and turned that into the mouthpiece. That's what it means that you turned it inside out. It would be difficult. You'd have to have, yeah.
Yeah, why would you? Anybody refers to the mouthpiece of the bell.
Right, yeah, I don't know exactly.
It's just mainly disturbing.
Yeah, it's kind of that uncanny valley type of thing, It's like you just took a shofar and yeah, probably. My taima, what is the reasoning why that's not good? Kidrav Masna. It's like the statement of Rav Masna, the Amr of Masna, the Havarta, that the Torah says that you will pass the shofar through the land of Israel when we blow the shofar at the beginning of the Yovel year to free the slaves. So derech ha'avaraso ba'inan, the term that's used is that you will pass it, meaning that the shofar is supposed to be done in the way that it's normally used, meaning that the tip of it turns into the mouthpiece, and where it's attached to the head of the animal is where the sound comes from. All right, now the Gemara continues with another statement of the Mishnah. We are again 4 lines down into the wide lines on 27b. Dibek shivrei shofaros pasal. So the Mishnah stated that if you glue together pieces of shofar, it is invalid. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned. Hosif alav kol shehu. If you added anything to the shofar, bein b'mino, whether it was of shofar material, bein shlo b'mino, or whether it was not shofar material, pasal, then it is invalid. Nikev, if it had a hole in it, stamo, and you plugged it up, bein b'mino, whether you used shofar bits to do that, bein shlo b'mino, whether you did not, pasal, it is invalid. Rabbi Nassan Omer, the Mino Kasher, Rabbi Nassan disagrees. He says that if you used shofar material to plug the shofar, it's kasher. Shelo b'mino, but if you used non-shofar material pasal, then it is pasal. It is invalid. B'mino, okay. We are on 27b in the wide lines of the Gemara, about 6 lines down. Morning. So we said, b'mino kasher, that if you used, according to Rav Nassan, if you used the shofar material to plug the shofar, then it remains kosher. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, v'hush nishtayir rubo, as long as there's still a majority of the original shofar there. Miklal de shelo b'mino, afal pish nishtayir rubo pasal. That which means, working backwards, if Rav Nassan says that you can use shofar material to plug a hole as long as there's majority shofar material, that means that if you plug it with non-shofar material, even if you have a majority of shofar, it's still not kosher. Some learn the same discussion in Reb Nassan on the end of the Mishnah, or on the end of the statement of the Mishnah. Shelo b'mino pasal. We stated in the Mishnah that if it's not the material of the shofar, then it's invalid. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, "V'hu shenivchas rubo," as long as it is invalid if you're missing a majority of the shofar. Miklal, which means the b'mino, if it is of shofar material, alpa pisha nivchas rubo, even if you are missing most of the shofar material kosher, then it is kosher. So you have 2 opposing versions of this discussion, one which is totally stringent and one which is almost entirely lenient. Okay, we are on 27b in the wider lines of the Gemara. Right now we are up to about 10 to 12 lines in. Let me see. Yeah, about 10 lines in. Okay, the middle of the line, it says tzipehu zahav mibafnim. If you gilded it in gold on the inside of the shofar, pasal, then it is invalid. Mibachutz, if it's on the outside, im nishtana kolo mikmos shahaya, if it changes the sound of the shofar from what it used to be, pasal, then it is invalid. V'im lav kasher, otherwise it is kosher. Nistakli orko, if it got a split in the shofar, a crack in the shofar along the length of it, pasal, then it is invalid. L'rochbo, but if it's on the width of the shofar, im nishtayr bo shir tekiya, as long as it has what we're going to call a shir tekiya, the size of a shofar blowing, kosher, then it is kosher. V'im lav pasal, otherwise it's going to be invalid. We're going to discuss in just one second what is this size of a shofar blowing. Gemara asks, "V'kama shir tekiah? What is the size of a shofar blowing?" Pirish Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel explains, "Kadei sheyuchazenu biyado." As long as you can hold the shofar, v'yira lakan ulakan, and it's visible on both sides of the hand. Okay, that is the minimum size of a shofar. Hayakolo dak o ava. If the sound of the shofar is very thin or very thick, otsar or otsaror, or if it's very dry, kosher, the shofar remains kosher. Shekola kolos kshem, because all sounds are kosher, b'shofar, in the brackets up there, of the shofar. All shofar sounds are good, valid sounds for blowing the shofar. And you see this all the time. When I was in Baltimore at my yeshiva, the yeshiva was still using the same shofar blower that they'd been using for 50 years, right? And he was really kind of getting up there in years, and his shofar blowing was difficult. He was at a point where he couldn't really make so much of a sound from the shofar, and he was still doing it, and we still fulfilled the mitzvah because any sound that comes from the shofar counts as the shofar blowing sound. As long as the shofar itself is kosher, yeah. Now, I don't know if that means that you could just kind of blow into it like a beer bottle, and if that works, like, I don't think that. I think it has to be like actual tooting sound. I don't know, but they sent a question to the father of Shmuel. Kadcho b'takabo yatsa. That if you drill a hole in the shofar and you blow through it, you fulfill your mitzvah. So the Gemara asks, Pshita, obviously, kulunami mektach kadchu. All shofars have a hole drilled in them, right? Cows don't come with a hole on the end of their horn, right? So there's a hole drilled in it at some point. Amar Avashi shekadcho bezachruso. What we're talking about is where you drill the hole in the masculine part of the shofar. So that means that on the animal's head, there are two kind of lumps where the shofar goes, and the shofar is on the outside kind of connected to those lumps, right? Here what you did was, instead of pulling the shofar off the head of the animal, you cut it with the bone, with the skull bone still inside. That skull bone is called the masculine part of the shofar, all right? It's inside the other piece, all right? That what we're talking about is you have the whole shofar and you drill a hole through that with the bone still inside of it. You might have thought that even though it's all the same material, it's all animal byproduct, it would be a problem and would not be a kosher shofar. Kamash Milan, that's why the Gemara had to tell you that it still remains a kosher shofar, even if you did that. I don't know how it would sound. I don't know. We do not do this, but it would technically be kosher. And again, that's typical for the terminology of the Gemara. Whenever it uses the word kosher, it means that you shouldn't do it, but it's fine if you did. Okay. So now we are on the bottom of 27b by the two dots, the colons over there. So the Mishnah mentioned that if you blow the shofar into a pit, different types of pits or cisterns, then it depends on who you are, where you are, what you're hearing, and that's we're going to discuss that. Amar Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, Lo shanu ela la'osan hom de'malsfas habar. We said in the Mishnah that you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. That's if you're standing outside of the pit. The guy blew the shofar into the pit, and you're standing outside of the pit. Aval osan hom dim babor. If you're standing inside the pit with the guy, yatsu, then they fulfill their mitzvah. Tani nami hachi. We have a similar brisa that says, Hatokea l'soch habor or l'soch hadus. If you blow the shofar into a pit or a cistern, yatsa, you fulfill your mitzvah. V'hatanan, didn't we learn in the Mishnah lo yatsa that you did not fulfill your mitzvah? Elalav shmamina must be, like we're saying, Kidur Rav Huna, like Rav Huna stated, that it depends on where you're standing, the listener. Shmamina, and that's how we come out. Some learn the same statement of the Gemara, but not as a question, but as a contradiction. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, that the Mishnah says that if you blow it into a pit or a cistern, you do not fulfill your mitzvah. Tanya, didn't we learn in a brisa yatsa that you do fulfill your mitzvah? Amar Rav Huna, so Rav Huna, the same Rav Huna says, lo kasha, it's not a question. Kan lo sanam dem alsfas habor, kan lo sanam dem babor. This is referring to the ones who are standing on the edge of the pit, They're outside, so they're listening to the echo of the shofar, not the shofar itself. And here where we said you do fulfill your mitzvah, that's where you're standing inside the pit and you're listening to the shofar itself. Okay? We're now on the last two words of 27b, moving on to 28a. Amar Rabba. Rabba says, or according to some opinions, this is really Rabba, Shama miktsas tekiya babor. If you listen to part of the shofar blowing inside the pit, miktsas tekiya al sfasa bor, and then you moved in the middle of the shofar blowing to outside the pit. Yatsa, you fulfill your mitzvah. Miktsas tekiya kodem shiala amud hashachar. If you listened to the shofar blowing partially before the first rays of sunlight show up in the day, and then you listen to part of it after that point, lo yatsi, did not fulfill your mitzvah. So we have two seemingly contradictory ideas. Okay, the first piece, that if you hear part of it inside the pit and part of it outside the pit, we said you did fulfill your mitzvah. Now, that seems to be saying that you only have to hear part of the sound, right? Because that other part of the sound that you heard outside the pit was not a fulfillment of the mitzvah, typically. But here we said one shofar blowing, you heard half of it inside the pit, half of it outside the pit, you fulfill your mitzvah. But then the same statement we said that if you hear part of the shofar blowing during the time of shofar, and then part of it before the time of shofar, you do not fulfill your mitzvah, which seems to indicate that if you hear part of a shofar blowing, you do not fulfill your mitzvah. So we have a seeming contradiction in this statement. Amar le Abai, my shna. So Abai asks this question: what's the difference between the two cases? Right? Why is it that blowing inside the pit, partially inside, partially outside, you do fulfill, and when you blow partially during the time, partially outside the time, you do not fulfill the mitzvah? So he explains, Hasam diba'ina kula tekiya b'chiyuva v'leka. When you have the shofar at the wrong time, when you're doing it as the sun is, or as the light is coming into the day, right? So part of that tekiya was before the time. So you need to have the entire tekiya during a period of obligation, and you do not have that. The Gemara says, "Hachanami be'ena kula tekiya b'chiyuva v'leka." Don't you have the same issue with the pit? Again, you're still stuck with the same issue with the pit. In the pit, you are partially fulfilling your obligation, partially not. So haki hashta hasam laila avzman chiyuvahu. So Gemara explains that there's an essential difference over here. Nighttime, which is before the first rays of sunlight show up, is nighttime still. So nighttime is not a time of obligation at all, klal at all. Hacha bor makom chiyuvahu. However, a pit is a place where there is an obligation. Even inside the pit, you have an obligation to hear shofar. So the obligation of shofar exists inside the pit and outside the pit. So that one shofar blowing, even though you've only heard part of it, you're all hearing it in a situation of obligation, okay? As opposed to in the doing it partially before the day and partially during the day, there it's not even a situation of obligation. Okay. Sorry, I missed a few words. The pit is a place of obligation for those who are sitting inside the pit. Okay. So this all was coming from a statement of Rabbah. Remember, does that mean to tell? Are you telling me the Sava Rabbah Shama Sof Tekiya below Techilas Tekiya below Techilas Tekiya Yatza? Are you what it sounds like is that if Rabbah holds that if you heard the end of a shofar blowing, just the end of the Tekiya, without the beginning of the Tekiya, sounds like from Rabbah that you would fulfill your obligation. And we are deducing from that Techilas Tekiya below Sof Tekiya Yatza, the same thing would apply the other way. If you only heard the beginning of the shofar blowing and not the end, you would also fulfill your mitzvah. That's what it sounds like to me, right? That's what the Gemara is saying. Tashema. So let's take a second and look into this. Takabari Shona, umashach b'shniya kishtayim. So the Gemara says, what about a case where you blew one tekiya, and then on the second tekiya, you blew a really long one. So it was as long as two tekiyos. Ein biyado ala achas, that second tekiya is not counted as two different tekiyos, it's one tekiya. Vamai. So the Gemara says, why? Tesalak le betarti, we should count that as two tekiyos because you heard the beginning of a tekiah and the end of a tekiah. Basically, the way we're looking at it is if you only have to hear a half a tekiah, so if you have a double tekiah that's twice as long, let's split that in half, call the beginning of it the end of one tekiah and the end of it the beginning of the second tekiah, and you have two half tekiahs, and that counts as two. It doesn't sound logical, which is why the Gemara is about to say, we do not divide the tekios into different pieces. Okay? So one tekiah is not going to be divided into multiple pieces. All right? Just to catch up where we are on 28a at the last word, which is actually an acronym, about 12, 13 lines down. Maybe a little bit more. Hold on a second. About 15 lines down. Last word on the line, which again is an acronym, Tashema. All right, so we're going to inspect this a little further. All right, if you blow into any one of these different types of cisterns, Im kol shofar shama, if you're listening to the sound of the shofar, yatsa, you fulfill your mitzvah. Im kol havara shama, if you're listening to the sound of the echo, lo yatsa, you're not fulfilling your mitzvah. Vamai, why is that true? You should fulfill your mitzvah by hearing the sound before the echo starts up, right? So there's a moment, I mean, obviously we're talking about the speed of sound, but there's a moment where you heard the sound of the shofar before you heard the echo. So why don't we count that minute period of time where you heard the sound of the shofar before the echo and call that you're listening to the shofar? Again, you only need to hear part of the tekiah according to Rabbah, as we're understanding him. So Gemara says, no. Kika Amar Rabbah, when Rabbah was speaking, the whole time that Rabbah was speaking, when he said his whole thing about standing partially inside the pit and partially outside of the pit and all that, that was talking about Betokeav Olel and Afshay. You're blowing your shofar for yourself. Okay? So the whole time you're listening to the tekiah anyway. You're the shofar blower. So no matter what, you are definitely hearing the shofar sound, not the echo. But anybody else listening to you is going to be mixed up with echoes and shofar sounds, and it's going to be they're not fulfilling their mitzvah. So if that's the case, what's his whole point of coming to tell us this? The shofar blower himself anyway is fulfilling the obligation just by blowing, right? He doesn't even have to hear the sound of the shofar, I think. You might have thought that what if you have a case where the guy has his head outside the pit, but the shofar is inside the pit, right? It's right on the threshold of the pit. And that is a mixture of sound that doesn't count for his mitzvah. And that's why Rabbah had to come to tell you that partially inside, partially outside is altogether a good shofar blowing for the guy blowing the shofar. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says. Now Rabbi Yehuda is now going to bring us into a whole new discussion, but we're in the context of shofars that are kosher and shofars that aren't kosher. So now he's bringing us another thing that was not mentioned in the Mishnah. B'shofar shel ola lo yitaka. If you have a shofar from a carbon ola, so a carbon ola is a burnt offering that is totally burnt. Okay, so you took the shofar off of this carbon and you blew with it. You should not blow with it. The im taka, but if you did, yatsu, you fulfilled your mitzvah. The shofar shel shlamim. If you blew the shofar if you took the shofar from a cow, or any animal really, any kosher animal, which can be brought in the base of mikdash, can be brought as a carbon shlamim, which is a peace offering, much more lenient. It's your own. It belongs to you the entire time. Lo yitaka, you still should not blow with that shofar. V'im taka, if you did blow with it, lo yatsi, you did not fulfill your mitzvah. Okay. Now that's a strange thing. Usually, ola, being a higher level of carbon, is more stringent. So why over here is it less stringent? The ola, you fulfill your mitzvah if you do it. You shouldn't do it, but if you do, you fulfill your mitzvah. And the shlamim, which is usually a lower level of carbon, here you're taking from the carbon and you're stealing from the carbon basically. And if you did it, you did not fulfill your mitzvah. So what's the difference? Why is there a difference over here? My taima, what's the reasoning? Ola bas me'ilahi. Well, since an ola is more stringent as a higher level of carbon, it also has an issue of me'ila, trespassing. You're stealing from the base of mikdash when you take from your carbon ola. Kaven de ma'alba, but that means it's a strange kind of quirk in the laws of Me'ilah that once you trespass, once you steal from the Beis Hamikdash, nafka la'lechulin, now it has left Beis Hamikdash property, like all stolen objects. At some point, they leave the original owner's property, and you do own them for all intents and purposes. You may have an opportunity. You may have an obligation to pay back. In the case of Me'ilah, you have to bring a carbon and pay money and get lashes sometimes. Whatever. There's a whole bunch of things you have to do. But the item now belongs to you. Shlamim, however, a carbon shlamim, the lower level carbon, the peace offering, the lav b'nei me'ilah ninu, there isn't really trespassing in the same way, in the same degree. Yisuruhu derachim, so there remains a status of carbon on it the entire time. It's never your own object. So again, it's an interesting quirk in the laws of trespassing that by when there's a higher level of me'ilah, you actually own it when you steal it, as opposed to if there's no severe obligation of me'ilah, it remains based on his property the entire time, and so now you're blowing a shofar that doesn't belong to you. Okay, again, an interesting quirk. Below nafki l'chunel in the brackets there, it says it never leaves to the property of non-carbon, so it never becomes yours, and you did not fulfill your mitzvah when you blew the shofar. Okay, now the Gemara is going to take this to pieces. Maskif lo Rava. Rava asks on this. Again, the owner of our statement was Rabbi Yehuda, who was a second generation Gemara rabbi, Amora. And now we have Rava, who's third generation. So he's the next generation. He asks on this, Emas Ma'al, when did you trespass? When did you steal the property of the Beis Hamikdash? Lebasar the taka. You only stole it, it's only considered stealing once you blew the shofar. So one of the rules of Me'ilah, one of the rules of trespassing, Beis Hamikdash property, is you have to do something with the item for it to be stealing. So just taking it from the carbon is not enough. When did you actually perform the act of stealing from the Beis Hamikdash? You only did that once you blew the shofar. But that means kikataka b'isur taka. When you blew the shofar, it still was Beis Hamikdash property while you were blowing the shofar. So if that's the case, you shouldn't be fulfill your mitzvah. Same issue we had by the carbon shlamim. Ella Amar Rava, so rather Rava says differently. Echad zeh echad zeh, whether it's from a ola or whether it's from a shlamim lo yatsa, you did not fulfill your mitzvah. Okay, that's Rava's first iteration. Hadar Amar, later Rava came back and said, Echad zeh yatsa. Either case, you do fulfill your obligation. Why? Why is it that suddenly Rav is switching his sides and saying that even a carbon shlamim, you would fulfill the peace offering, the shofar from the peace offering, you would suddenly fulfill your obligation? Mitzvahs lavle hanos didnu. That's because he realized that there's a rule that a mitzvah is not considered hana'ah. It's not considered pleasure. You don't derive pleasure from a mitzvah. Meaning, we do derive pleasure from mitzvahs. We enjoy doing mitzvahs, but that's not that joy or benefit that you gain from a mitzvah is not counted as benefit in regards to all halachos that have to do with benefit. So, for example, when you get married, so the husband gives the wife a certain amount of money, and that amount of money has to be at least a pruta, which is roughly anywhere between 3 and 25 cents. That's the amount of money that the husband has to give the wife to be married. We do that with the ring. Okay? So there, the woman has to receive some amount of halachic benefit from that money. So if that money is mitzvah money, somehow, whatever, there would be cases of that. The Gemara in Kedushin goes through that. It would not be a good engagement because she did not receive benefit from it. All right. Same thing over here. You need to do a mitzvah. You need to blow your shofar. That's not called benefit in regards to stealing from the Beis Hamikdash. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So now Rabbi Yehuda, again, Rabbi Yehuda, the same one we mentioned just a couple lines ago, he's back and he has another statement. B'shofar shel avodah zara lo yitaka. If you have a shofar from avodah zara, all right, so this animal was avodah zara, and you took it off the animal, and you blew with it, you should not blow with it. V'im taka, but if you did, yatsa, you do fulfill your mitzvah. However, b'shofar shel ir hanidachas lo yitaka. If you have a shofar from an ir hanidachas, you should not blow. V'im taka lo yatsa. And if you did blow, you would not fulfill your mitzvah. So Ir Hanidachas is the city of the city that most of the city is serving avodah zara, and with if you have witnesses and the whole thing, and the largest based in the largest court in Jerusalem sits down, they say the city is liable for death penalty, and the entire city gets destroyed. They kill everyone. They gather the entire all the stuff of the city into the main street, and they burn it all to pieces. Okay, and we never rebuild it again. So this, by the way, has never occurred in history, according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin. All right, so this never actually happened, although there is an opinion that it happened once. Either way, if you have a shofar that somebody stole from this Ir Hanidachas, you do not fulfill your mitzvah, even if you blew the shofar. So again, we have a Avodah Zara shofar, shouldn't do it, but if you did, you do fulfill your mitzvah. Ir Hanidachas shofar, if you shouldn't blow with it, and if you do, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. My timer, what's the difference between the two cases? Ir Hanidachas ketuse mechtas shiurei. Because with the Ir Hanidachas, and this is we have this show up a couple times in halacha, since everything in the city is supposed to get burned, so we look at it as anything that's supposed to get burned, we look at it halachically as though it is burned right now. All right. Now we mentioned 1 page ago that the size of a shofar is that it has to be long enough that you can hold in your hand and it's visible on both sides of your hand when you're holding it, when you're grasping it in your hand. So in that case, the shofar that we're looking at as a pile of ashes right now, even though it's sitting in front of us, halachically it's a pile of ashes. It doesn't have the size of a shofar. That's all. And that's why you can't use it. We do the same thing with a lulav. Gemara talks about a lulav, the same issue. If you have a lulav from an Ir Hanidachas, lulav has to have 4 tfachim of size, 4 handbreadths of size. So if it's stolen from Ir Hanidachas, it could be 100 miles long. It's a pile of ashes and doesn't have the size of a lulav. All right, so same thing over here. Okay. We are now nearing the end of the page. We're about 15 lines up from the end of the page. First words on the line, Amarava. Hamudar Haname Chavero. So again, now we brought in now the discussion of the benefiting from the mitzvah. If let's say one person says, I swear to not have any benefit from this other person, right? So let's take an example. I say, I hate Ian. I do not want to have anything to do with Ian. Ian cannot do any benefit. I will have no benefit from Ian ever again. Okay, let's say. I don't, by the way. So Ian can still blow the shofar for me, even though I'm not allowed to have benefit from Ian. He can still blow the shofar for me, as we see, because the mitzvah. It's not called hana. It's not called benefit. Hamudar hana me shofar. Same thing. If I said I hate this shofar, I will never have benefit from this shofar. That also mutar l'tkoa bo tkiyah shel mitzvah. I myself can even blow the shofar. That shofar for myself. Okay. Amar Rava. So Amar Rava, and Rava also says, Hamudar Hana Mechavero, if again, in our case with Ian, right? I don't like Ian. Maza alav mechatas b'mos hageshamim avalo b'mos hachama. In this case is interesting, there's a difference. So if I'm Tameh Mace, if I have come in contact with a dead body and I want to go up to the base of Mikdash and bring a carbon on Yantif or whatever it is, so I'm going to have Kara Aduma, the red heifer water, sprinkled on me. So let's say Ian's my red heifer guy. He can sprinkle the water on me, but only during the winter. Okay. So during the winter, it's wet outside. You don't want to be more wet. So he can sprinkle the water on me because it's not. People don't appreciate getting water sprinkled on them during the winter. But if it's during the summer, where an ice cube down your back, a little spritz on your face is nice feeling. So then Ian cannot sprinkle the water on me. If you did, then I would be, then I would be going against my vow, and I would have to rectify that somehow. It's a big problem, actually. Again, I don't actually hate Ian. We like Ian. Ian's a good guy. Hamudar Hana Memayan. Okay, if you swear off a certain spring, all right. So springs, you're able to go to the mikveh in springs for certain levels of tuma. Of contamination. Again, we're going to have the same difference between winter and summer. So you're allowed to go to the mikveh in this spring during the winter, not during the summer. Okay. Interestingly enough, we don't avoid the Shmuel. The father of Shmuel doesn't show up that often. He showed up 1 page ago and he's here again. So it's interesting that he shows up twice in the same area. They sent a message to the father of Shmuel. Kafa'o va'achal matzah. Let's say someone forced you to eat matzah. You fulfill your mitzvah. Obviously, we're talking about on Pesach. Okay? So the Gemara asks, wait a second. Kafa'o man, who forced you to eat the matzah? Who forced you into eating matzah? Ilema kafa'o shade. If it's that literally a demon possessed you to eat matzah. Now, what that really means, as you're going to see from the next line of the Gemara, it sounds like he went crazy and he ate matzah against his will. He wasn't thinking about eating matzah. He just went crazy and grabbed the first thing that was in front of him at the Seder and happens to be matzah. But yeah, but from the answer of the Gemara, it doesn't seem that we're talking about actual possession. V'hatanya, didn't we learn in a brisa? Itim cholim, itim shaita. If you have a person who's sometimes lucid and sometimes crazy, kishu cholim, when he's in his insane stage, harehu kipikeach. Sorry, kishu cholim, when he's lucid, harehu kipikeach l'chol dvarav. He's considered totally in control of his actions, and everything that he does is a mitzvah. Kishu shota, but when he is insane, then he's considered insane for all his actions. So if you have this person who's possessed or whatever, something's forcing him to eat the matzah against his will, he's in a state of craziness. And at that point, he should not fulfill his mitzvah. We said he did fulfill his mitzvah. So that can't be what we mean when we say he was forced into eating matzah. So Gemara answers, Amar Avashi, which is the last generation of Gemara rabbis, Shekafu Parsiim. We're talking about where the Persians forced them to eat matzah. So the Persians are, at least in the later generations of the Gemara, Persians end up being like our worst enemies. They're terrible. We really did not appreciate them. That was historically when they switched over to Zoroastrianism and they became much more violent and not pleasant to be around. For most of our period of time in Babylonia, we were really doing pretty well. It's when they switched religions that it got much more complex, and they started Hanukkah coming up. That was one of the things. I don't want to get too off topic, but they had a rule against lighting fires on their holiday. You couldn't light a fire anywhere besides for in their temples. So that always seems to have fallen out during Hanukkah. So what do you do about lighting your Hanukkah candles if the authorities are going to come in and they'll kill you or whatever, throw you in jail for lighting a Hanukkah candle? So the Gemara and Shabbos discussed that. Amar Rava. Rava states, Zosomeris. This is what we're talking about when we say Hatokei l'shir yatsa. That if you're blowing your shofar and you love the tune, you fulfill your mitzvah. Okay, so the same way that when you're forced to eat matzah by the Persians, you fulfilled your mitzvah. So too, when you are just playing the shofar because it sounds like a good tune to you, you also fulfill the mitzvah. So the Gemara asks Shita. Obviously, Hanuhach is the same case. You're not intending to do the mitzvah, but the mitzvah is happening, so you fulfill the mitzvah. So Mahu the Tema, meaning the Gemara is asking, why do Rava have to connect the two cases, connect the dots for us? Really, they're the same underlying principle. So the Gemara answers, Mahu the Tema, you might have thought, if we didn't have Rava's statement, you might have thought, Hasam achol matzah, echol matzah rachmana, so the Torah tells you to eat matzah, but you did eat matzah, and that's why you fulfill the mitzvah. Flipping on to 28b, aval hacha, but in our case, Zichron Truah Ksiv. It doesn't say listen to the shofar. It says remember the sound of the shofar. Behind Masasik Bala here, you're not really thinking about shofar. It's that your brain's not in it. You're thinking about the tune that you're enjoying. So you might think that you would not fulfill the mitzvah. That's why Rava had to come and link the two cases together, Kamash Malan, to tell you that you do fulfill the mitzvah in both cases. Now, this is going to be difficult for us halachically nowadays because we do not hold to the next line of the Gemara. Alma Kasava Rava sounds
what
like
if someone's deaf?
Sorry?
What about the deaf?
So that's an interesting question. I don't know much about it. Typically, when we have a mitzvah and you're incapable of performing the mitzvah, so you're in the category of an ones. That's somebody who's unfortunately unable to fulfill the mitzvah. And we have a rule that ones rachmana patre, that the Torah excludes you from the mitzvah, does not require you to do the mitzvah. I read in an article once that in the deaf community, there's two deaf communities. There's the deaf and proud of being deaf community, and there's the deaf and wants to fix it part of the deaf community. So there's like some will get a cochlear implant if they can and try to hear if they can, and some refuse to, and they want to own the fact that they're deaf. So I read an article once, somebody interviewed a rabbi from this community that they want to remain deaf. He said that what they do is they like stick their ear really into the shofar. The guy blows it directly into their ear, and they could hear a very faint sound or something like that. He said for himself, very faintly they hear something, and he's like, "What are you worried about? You're going to make me deaf? I am deaf, right?" So again, I don't know if that's even an obligation. But I read that article once. Again, I don't think that's an obligation. If a person is deaf, they really don't have a mitzvah of hearing shofar, unfortunately, right? Same way that I don't have a mitzvah of anything that applies to women or a kohen or anything like that, right? So this deaf person, unfortunately, does not have the mitzvah of shofar.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Continuing on. So Rava again holds Alma Kasavra, second line of the Gemara. It seems like Rava is stating that mitzvos ain't tzrichos kavana. The mitzvos do not require kavana. You don't have to have intention to do the mitzvah. As he said, you could be playing Louis Armstrong and you're good to go. You fulfilled your mitzvah. That means you don't have to have intention to do the mitzvah. Ace We're going to ask a question. We have a Mishnah in Brachos that says you're reading the Torah. You're just doing your daily study, and you happen to be up to Parshas V'eschana. Okay? V'yagia zman mikra. You get up to the period, the part of the Torah where it has the Shema, right? So that's again Parshas V'eschana, 6th Aliyah, and you get up to there, and it happens to be time for Shema. So in Kivin Libo, the Mishnah says that if you have intention to fulfill your mitzvah with that reading, yatsa, you fulfill your mitzvah. Dim lav lo yatsa, otherwise you do not fulfill your mitzvah. My lav must be the basic understanding of that Mishnah would be kivin libo latses, that you had intention to fulfill your mitzvah. That when you said we had intention, right? I mistranslated it. The Mishnah says that if your kavana is there, if your intent is there, then you fulfill the mitzvah. So intent of what? The simple understanding of the Mishnah is, as I read it, which is why I made the mistake, right? The simple understanding of the Mishnah is that you had intent to fulfill the mitzvah. And you see that from this Mishnah that you have to intend to fulfill a mitzvah to fulfill the mitzvah, which is going against what Rava just told us. Well, Rava can't argue with a Mishnah. So Gemara says, no, you're misreading the Mishnah. Lo, likros, you had intent to read it. Gemara says, what? Likros, hakakari, you are reading it. No. Bekari lehagia. Until now, you were just reading it to make sure that the Torah was written appropriately. You were checking to see all the letters were in the right places. You were checking a Sefer Torah. Here, you have to have intent now to read it, but you still don't have intent. You don't need to have intention to fulfill your mitzvah of Shema, and you still fulfill your mitzvah of Shema. And this Mishnah is actually supporting Rava's idea that you do not need intention to fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, that's how we have it thus far. The Gemara is going to try to bring another proof against Rava, and we're going to have a similar retort. Tashema, okay, 7 lines down on 28b. If a person is walking behind a shul, or his house happens to be right next to the shul, v'shama kol shofar, or kol megillah, and he hears the shofar blowing, the Megillah being read, anything that you have to listen to. Im kivin libo, if you have intent, yatsa, then you fulfill your mitzvah. Im lav lo yatsa, if you don't have intent, you do not fulfill your mitzvah. So again, my lav, a simple reading of the Mishnah is im kivin libo latses, that you have intent to fulfill your mitzvah, which would be a refute to Rava. And Rava goes again and says, no. Lo lishmoa, if you have intent to listen, but not necessarily to fulfill your mitzvah, you still fulfill your mitzvah, even though your intent wasn't there to fulfill your mitzvah. Meaning, you can't be, vacuuming at the same time. You have to be listening to what's being said, even though your intent was not to fulfill the mitzvah. You have to at least be listening there and, oh right, the Megillah, I love this story, or something like that. V'hashama, Gemara says, obviously you're listening. What else would you be doing? So Savar Chamor Ba'almahu. We're talking about a case where he thought that sound that he was listening to was just the sound of a braying donkey. Okay? That would be where he's listening to the sound but not intending to fulfill the mitzvah. Okay? Esaves, the Gemara asks, Niskaven shomea v'lo niskaven mashmiya. We have another statement that says if the listener had intention, but the one making the sound did not have intention, or you have it the other way, where the sound maker had the intention, but not the listener. Lo yatsi, you do not fulfill the mitzvah. You have to have both the intention of the listener and the maker of the sound. I understand that the maker of the sound has to have intention. Sorry, I understand the case where the sound maker had intention, not the listener. Because it's a case where, again, he thought it was the braying of a donkey. How do you have a case where I'm listening to the sound of the shofar with intention, where the guy's making a sound with the shofar not having intention? How do you blow a shofar without intention to blow a shofar? Lav v'tokei l'shir? Isn't that a case, obviously, where the guy is blowing the shofar for the point of making a song? He's blowing it for music. And still, the Gemara says, the Mishnah or the statement says that you do not fulfill your mitzvah. So again, this whole problem is that Rava told us that if you blow the shofar for music, you did not fulfill your mitzvah. Rava said you do fulfill your mitzvah. Here we have a statement that seems to indicate that you did not fulfill your mitzvah in that case. Gemara says, Dilma de kamanabich navuche. It's not talking about where you were blowing it for music. It's talking about where you were just blowing through it. It wasn't, you were just kind of pushing air through it and not intending to make noise, right? You were cleaning it out, whatever it is. And that noise came out of it, but he had no intention for it to be a shofar blast, and the listener did. And in that case, the Gemara says you do not fulfill your mitzvah. And again, Rava still is of the opinion that you would fulfill your mitzvah if it was for music. Now, Rava's, so to speak, nemesis, they were good friends, but the anti-Rava in Gemara is Abaye. Amrle Abaye. So Abaye says, Elamayata, based on what you're telling me, Hayashin Bashmini Basukah, if you sleep in the sukkah on the 8th day of Sukkot, now there is no 8th day of Sukkot, right? It's Shmini Atzeres, it's a new holiday. There's no obligation of sukkah on the 8th day on Shmini Atzeres, right? So if you sleep in the sukkah, not intending to fulfill the mitzvah, you slept in the sukkah just because you enjoy sleeping outside, you should get lashes for having added to the mitzvah, right? We have one of the averos in the Torah is that you're not allowed to add to the mitzvahs. So you added to the mitzvah, you should get lashes for that. Amar Loi, so Rava responded to him, Shani Omer mitzvahs ain't over aleim ela b'zmana. No, you can only break a mitzvah, or you would only be liable for adding to a mitzvah during the time of the mitzvah. The 8th day of Sukkot, which again is not Sukkot, is not the time of Sukkot, and therefore there's no the issue of adding to the mitzvah of Sukkah on that time. Right. You're camping. Right. Mason Rav Shaman Bar Abba. Rav Shaman Bar Abba, again, later generation, asked, Minayin lakoyin sh'olo laduchen shlo yomer hoel v'nosna litar. Okay, I'm going to break this up a little bit. How do we know that if you have a kohen who went up to the duchen to bless the people, shlo yomer, he shouldn't say hoel v'nosna litar rishus levarich Yisrael, since the Torah gave me the permission to bless the Jewish people, osif bracha achas mishali. I'm going to add another bracha, right? There's 3 brachos in Berachas Kohanim. I'm going to add another one. Kagon Hashem Elokei Avosechem Yosef Aleichem, right? He decides to add this pasuk of Hashem, the God of your fathers, should add on to you blessing and wonderful things. Okay, how do we know that the Kohen should not do this whole thing? Because the Torah says don't add on to it. Don't add on to the mitzvahs of the Torah. So the Kohen's not supposed to add another bracha. But that, hold on. When he gave Berachas Kohanim, he said the 3 brachos, and now he's adding a 4th. But that means once he said the 3 brachos, he's finished the mitzvah. It's no longer the time of the mitzvah, and he's adding something, and the Torah tells you not to do it. So sleeping in the sukkah on the 8th day of Sukkot should be an issue. Because again, we have it again over here, you're past the time of the mitzvah, and still the Torah says not to do it. So that when we're discussing the case of the Berachas Kohanim, it's where you did not yet finish. So between the brachos, you added a bracha. So again, it says That's one version of the brisa. But if you have a brisa a little differently, there's another version that says after he finished the bracha, he adds the bracha. That's still an issue. So Gemara says, "Sayim bracha achas." That when it said that, it's talking about where you finished one of the three blessings. When he said you completed the blessings, you finished one blessing, and now you added it. Gemara says that, again, you're messing with the language that we have in the brisa. But Tanu, the way that we have it in the brisa is Sayim kol berchosav, that even after you finish all the blessings, it's still an issue of adding a blessing. So Gemara says, fine. Shani hacha, there's a difference by berachas kohanim. Because if the Kohen ended up in another shul later that day, Hadar Mavarech Kula Yoma. Hadar Mavarech, he would do Berachas Kohanim again. That means that Kula Yoma is Manehu. The entire day of every day, the entire daytime is a time of Berachas Kohanim, as opposed to the 8th day of the Shmini Atzeres, which is no longer a time of Sukkot. Okay, and we are going to stop here because it's 7:55. Thank you for joining us.
Joshua Koach.
Joshua,
All right,